Converting between a fraction, decimal and percentage. There are a few conversions that you should be aware of to do with converting between fractions, decimals and percentages. You should be aware that 0.5 as a decimal is the same as a half as a fraction, which also means 50% as a percentage. And you should also be aware that a quarter means to find 25% of something, and if we're to convert that to a decimal, we should be aware that it is 0.25. And they're two really common fractions, decimals and percentages equivalences. So they all mean the same thing. So 0.5 is the same as saying a half, which is the same as saying 50%. And likewise, 0.25 is the same as saying a quarter, which is the same as saying 25%. Now there's a few other common ones that hopefully we'll be aware of, but we'll just recap in this video. One hopefully you will be aware of is that 10% is the same as 0.1 as a decimal. And if we're to think about the word percent, it means out of 100. So this is a fraction, is 10 out of 100, which we can simplify down if we divide both bits by 10 to 1/10. Now, this fact here should help us with finding 0.3 as a fraction or as 30%. If we know that 0.1 is the same as 1/10, then 0.3, which is 3 times more than 0.1, should be 3/10. And as we said, percentages mean out of 100. So if we've got 9% on this last one, well, that as a fraction means we've got 9 out of 100. And to get our decimal, we need to divide our 9% by 100, which gives us 0.09. And you should hopefully notice that to get from every percentage to decimal, you divide by 100. And that is how you convert between a percentage and a decimal. Is to get from a decimal to a percentage, you times by 100. And to get from a percentage back to a decimal, you divide by 100. And that works in every one of our cases above. If we went from 0.5 and times it by 100, we get to 50. If we do 0.3 times 100, we get to 30. 0.09 times 100 gets us to 9%. But a more difficult one is how do you convert between a fraction and a decimal, or between a decimal and a fraction? Well, if we look at an easy one, 1/2, and we know that's equal to 0.5. Well, this means 1 divided into 2 parts, and 1 divided by 2 gives us 0.5. So what we're doing here is we're doing the numerator divided by the denominator, and that is how you convert from a fraction to a decimal. You do the numerator divided by the denominator, and sometimes you might need to use a calculator for that, or it might be one of the easier values like 1/2, which gives you 0.25. But the real difficult one is how do we get from the decimal to a fraction? Well, if you remember, if we look at these examples here, these two in particular, 0.09 was 9 out of 100, and 0.3 was 3 out of 10, which we could also say is 30 out of 100. And if we were to look at something like 0.125, we'd say this is 125 out of 1,000. Now, you should notice here, when we got 3 numbers after the decimal point, we had a fraction out of 1,000. When we had 1 number after the decimal point, we had a fraction out of 10. And when we had 2 numbers after the decimal point, we had a fraction out of 100. And that's how you convert between a decimal and a fraction. If it's 0.1, it's going to be something along the line of 1 out of 10. If it's 0.01, it's going to be 1 out of 100. And if it's 0.001, it's going to be 1 out of 1,000. And if you use that idea on any situation when you want to get from a decimal to a fraction, you'll be fine. Now what we're going to do is we're going to try and use these facts to apply it to an actual problem. And this is a typical question you might be asked when you look at proportion, because you can represent proportions as fractions, decimals or percentages. It says 250 people go to a rock concert. 45 of the people are male. What fraction, decimal and percentage of males are at the concert? Now I always like to go in order: fraction, decimal, percentage. And we're going to use our flowchart, which we've done above, to help us to get from one to the other. So, first thing is we need to set up a fraction. So we need to know firstly how many people went to the concert. Well, that's 250. And of those 250, how many were male? Well, 145 were male. So the fraction of people who went to the concert were male was 145 over 250. Now we need to go from the fraction to the decimal. So to get from a fraction to a decimal, we need to do the numerator divided by the denominator. So in this case, we need to do 145 divided by 250, which is 0.58. And finally, we need to now go from the decimal. And finally, to get from a decimal to a percentage, we have to do times by 100. So we're going to take our 0.58 and times it by 100. And that gives us 58%. And really, this is the real key thing to this video, is trying to remember this flowchart and how to convert from a fraction to a decimal to a percentage, and then to work backwards. So